Dawn broke over the frozen steppes of the Eastern Front in January 1943, revealing silhouettes of Panzer IV tanks emerging from the morning mist like spectral warriors returning to haunt familiar battlegrounds. Their hulls bore the scars of previous engagements, hastily patched armor plates, mismatched paint schemes, and the unmistakable modifications that transformed these once obsolete machines into deadly predators. Germany's desperate gamble was materializing before the eyes of both astonished Soviet observers and the grim-faced tank crews who would stake their lives on these resurrected machines. The story of how these aging tanks, outclassed and outgunned just months earlier, would return to become the backbone of Germany's armored forces represents one of military history's most remarkable tales of adaptation under fire. In the crucible of the Eastern Front, obsolete technology would meet innovative engineering to create a fighting machine that would defy expectations and write a new chapter in the history of armored warfare. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The genesis of the Panzer IV's resurrection began not with triumph, but catastrophe. Operation Barbarossa, Germany's massive invasion of the Soviet Union, had commenced on June 22, 1941, with spectacular initial success. German panzer divisions sliced through Soviet defenses with remarkable efficiency, encircling large formations and advancing hundreds of kilometers within weeks. At the spearhead of these operations, the Panzer IV performed admirably in its original role as an infantry support tank. With its short-barreled 75mm gun, it could effectively destroy Soviet bunkers, artillery positions, and the obsolescent tanks encountered during the early phases of the campaign. German tank crews rode a wave of victories, with some divisions advancing as much as 50 kilometers per day. Lieutenant Hans von Luck of the 7th Panzer Division recalled, "We moved like lightning through the Soviet lines. Their defenses seemed to dissolve before us, and their older tank models were no match for our coordinated tactics and superior gunnery." This early period of the campaign fostered dangerous overconfidence among German commanders and troops alike. However, as German forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory, disturbing reports began filtering back to high command. German tank crews were encountering something revolutionary, the T-34 medium tank. With its sloped armor, powerful 76.2mm gun, and excellent mobility, the T-34 represented a quantum leap in tank design that caught German planners completely by surprise. Equally shocking was the KV-1 heavy tank, whose thick armor proved nearly impervious to the standard German anti-tank weapons of 1941. Against these formidable new adversaries, the Panzer IV's short-barreled 75mm gun proved woefully inadequate. German tank commander Otto Carius would later recall, "The first time we encountered T-34s, it was a shock. We hit one with 3 shells at close range, and they simply bounced off. Then it returned fire and destroyed 2 of our tanks in seconds. We realized we were outclassed." This technological surprise quickly translated into a crisis of confidence among German tank crews, who found themselves in the unaccustomed position of being technically inferior to their opponents. By December 1941, the German offensive had ground to a halt before Moscow. The combination of the brutal Russian winter, for which German forces were ill-prepared, and fierce Soviet counterattacks pushed the Wehrmacht back for the first time in the war. During this crisis, the limitations of Germany's tank fleet became painfully apparent. The Panzer IV, which had formed the backbone of the panzer divisions, could not reliably penetrate the armor of Soviet medium tanks except at dangerously close ranges. Field reports from the front became increasingly desperate. "Our tanks are technically inferior to the Russian T-34s and KVs wrote Colonel General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Germany's mobile warfare tactics. The gap must be closed by technical means as soon as possible, or our panzer divisions will no longer be capable of offensive operations. The German High Command recognized the gravity of the situation, but developing entirely new tanks would take years, time they did not have as the war expanded to include the United States following Pearl Harbor. Instead, they turned to a more immediate solution, upgrading the existing Panzer IV. The transformation began in early 1942 with the introduction of the Panzer IV IOSF F2 variant. The most significant change was the replacement of the short 75mm gun with a long-barreled 75mm KWK 40L43, capable of penetrating the T-34's frontal armor at combat ranges up to 1,000 meters. Additional armor protection was added to the front hull and turret, providing better protection against Soviet anti-tank fire. While these upgrades increased the tank's weight and slightly reduced its mobility, they gave the Panzer IV a fighting chance against Soviet armor. Production lines at Krupp-Krusenwerk in Magdeburg and Vomag in Plauen began delivering these improved models to frontline units, but the numbers were insufficient to replace losses. The summer campaign of 1942, which saw German forces drive deep into the Caucasus and reach the Volga, continued to consume tanks at an alarming rate. By November 1942, as the situation at Stalingrad deteriorated, the Wehrmacht faced a critical shortage of armor across the Eastern Front. This crisis coincided with directives issued in December 1942, which ordered the maximization of weapons production and the recovery of damaged equipment from the battlefield. At a meeting of the Armaments Ministry, Albert Speer emphasized that every tank recovered and returned to battle is worth 2 new ones from our factories. This directive provided the institutional impetus for what would become one of the most remarkable logistical efforts of the war, the systematic recovery, repair, and upgrade of damaged Panzer IVs. Special recovery units, equipped with half-tracks and heavy cranes, ventured into contested territory to retrieve knocked out or abandoned tanks. These damaged machines were transported to field workshops established in the rear areas, where teams of mechanics worked around the clock to repair and upgrade them. The conditions in these field workshops were challenging beyond imagination. Many operated in unheated buildings or tents, with temperatures often falling below 30 degrees Celsius during the winter months. Mechanics worked with frozen hands, inadequate tools, and chronic shortages of spare parts. Unteroffizier Klaus Weber, who served in one such repair unit, described the conditions. "We worked 16-hour shifts with only short breaks. Our hands were constantly numb from the cold, and we had to heat tools over fires before we could handle them. But we knew that every tank we returned to service might save the lives of our comrades at the front." This determination drove remarkable innovations. When official spare parts were unavailable, mechanics improvised solutions, manufacturing replacement components from scrap metal, adapting parts from other vehicles, or creating hybrid systems that would have horrified the original designers, but functioned effectively in the field. The most critical aspect of this refurbishment program was the upgrade of the Panzer IV's main armament. Damaged tanks equipped with the short-barreled 75mm gun were retrofitted with the longer L-43 or L-48 guns, dramatically increasing their anti-tank capability. This conversion was far from straightforward. It required modifications to the turret, new recoil systems, and updated fire control equipment. Yet, despite these complexities, skilled technical teams managed to complete such conversions in as little as 5 days when parts were available. Additionally, many tanks received improved armor protection in the form of bolt-on Schürzen, skirt armor, thin steel plates mounted on the sides of the hull and turret that provided protection against Soviet anti-tank rifles, and shaped charge warheads. By January 1943, the first batches of these refurbished and upgraded Panzer IVs began returning to frontline units, just in time to face the growing Soviet winter offensive that threatened to collapse the entire German southern front following the events at Stalingrad. The first major test for these resurrected tanks came in February 1943 during the Third Battle of Kharkov. Following the defeat of German forces at Stalingrad, Soviet armies had launched a massive offensive aimed at retaking the industrial heartland of Ukraine. The key objective was Kharkov, a major transportation hub that had changed hands twice already during the war. As Soviet forces approached the city, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein assembled a counterattack force that included elite armored formations equipped with a substantial number of the refitted Panzer IVs. On February 19th, these forces struck the overextended Soviet columns south of Kharkov. The battle would provide the first real combat assessment of whether the upgraded tanks could match Soviet armor. The results exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. The long-barreled guns of the refitted Panzer IVs proved capable of penetrating T-34 armor at ranges up to 500 meters, allowing German forces to engage from advantageous positions before Soviet tanks could close to effective firing range. Tank Commander Michael Wittmann, who commanded a Panzer IV during this battle, noted in his after-action report, "The improved gun gave us the ability to engage Russian tanks before they could effectively return fire." This advantage was crucial, as we remained outnumbered in most engagements. The additional armor protection, while not impervious to Soviet 76.2 mm guns, provided enough resilience to survive glancing hits that would have penetrated earlier models. By March 15th, German forces had recaptured Kharkov, dealing a significant blow to Soviet momentum and stabilizing the front. The battle demonstrated that the refitted Panzer IVs could be effective when employed with appropriate tactics and in sufficient concentration. The success at Kharkov provided a template for how these upgraded tanks would be employed throughout 1943. Rather than being evenly distributed among all Panzer units, the refitted Panzer IVs were concentrated in elite formations like the Grossdeutschland Division. These units were used as fire brigades, held in reserve and committed to critical sectors to contain Soviet breakthroughs or spearhead limited counterattacks. This approach maximized the impact of the limited number of upgraded tanks available. It also reflected a broader shift in German strategy as the initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Soviet side. The mobile operations of 1941-42 gave way to a more defensive posture, with offensive operations limited in scope and carefully targeted. For the tank crews themselves, the upgraded Panzer IVs represented a new lease on life. Feldwebel Erwin Kressmann, who had survived the initial Soviet counteroffensive before Moscow in a short-barreled Panzer IV, described his reaction to receiving one of the refitted models. "When we saw the long gun, our morale improved immediately. For the first time in months, we felt we could fight the T-34 on something approaching equal terms. The psychological effect cannot be overstated. We were no longer simply targets." This renewed confidence translated into more aggressive tactics, with German tank crews willing to engage Soviet armor rather than avoiding contact whenever possible. Training programs were revised to emphasize the strengths of the upgraded tanks, their superior optics, more precise gunnery, and better radio communications, while minimizing exposure to their remaining vulnerabilities, particularly their side and rear armor. As spring arrived in 1943, both sides prepared for what would become the defining armored clash of World War II, the Battle of Kursk. The massive Soviet salient around Kursk presented an irresistible target for German planners. By pinching off this bulge, they hoped to destroy significant Soviet forces and straighten their defensive line. Operation Citadel, as the offensive was codenamed, would bring together the largest concentration of German armor ever assembled on the Eastern Front. Among the 2,700 tanks and assault guns deployed for this operation, refitted Panzer IVs formed the backbone of most panzer divisions. They would fight alongside the newer, more powerful Panthers and Tigers. but in greater numbers. The offensive began on July 5, 1943, with German forces attacking from both north and south in an attempt to encircle Soviet forces within the salient. The southern attack, spearheaded by Army Detachment Kempf and elite Panzer Corps, made initial progress against fierce Soviet resistance. Here, the Panzerwehrfees encountered a new challenge: heavily fortified Soviet defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire, extensive minefields, and pre-registered artillery. The Soviet defenders had spent months preparing, creating defensive belts up to 300 kilometers deep. Against these formidable defenses, the limitations of even the upgraded Panzer IVs became apparent. While they could hold their own against T-34s in mobile combat, they lacked the heavy armor needed to survive in the face of concentrated anti-tank defenses. Soviet 50mm anti-tank guns could penetrate their armor at combat ranges, and the newer 85mm guns proved lethal. Nevertheless, the Panzerwehrfees pressed forward alongside their heavier counterparts, gradually grinding through the Soviet defenses until they reached the area around Prokhorovka. On July 12th, the battle reached its climax near Prokhorovka, where German armored formations collided with the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army in what would become history's largest tank battle. Amid clouds of dust and smoke, hundreds of tanks engaged at point-blank range in a confused melee that defied traditional tactics. Junior Officer Franz Staudiger, commanding a Panzer IV in this engagement, described the chaos. Visibility was reduced to less than 100 meters by dust and smoke. Soviet tanks appeared suddenly out of this murk, often at ranges too close for effective gunnery. It became a brawl, with tanks firing, ramming, and maneuvering frantically to avoid being hit. In these conditions, the Panzerwehr's good all-around visibility and responsive handling proved advantageous. While they could not match the firepower of Tigers or the newer Soviet heavy tanks, their numbers and reliability made them crucial to the battle. By day's end, hundreds of tanks from both sides lay disabled on the battlefield, and the German offensive had effectively stalled. The Battle of Kursk marked a turning point not just for the war on the Eastern Front, but for the Panzer IV itself. The limitations of even the upgraded models were now clear. They could compete with standard T-34s, but newer Soviet designs like the T-34-85, which mounted an 85mm gun, and IS-2 heavy tank outclassed them significantly. Moreover, production of the Panzer IV was increasingly affected by Allied strategic bombing and resource constraints. Despite these challenges, the tank remained in production until the end of the war, with approximately 8,800 units produced, more than any other German tank. This production record speaks to both the platform's adaptability and the desperate need for armored vehicles as Germany fought an increasingly defensive war on multiple fronts. Following the failure of Operation Citadel, German forces on the Eastern Front transitioned to a strategic defensive. The massive Soviet summer offensive, which began shortly after Kursk, pushed German forces steadily westward. For the crews of the Panzer IVs, this meant a fundamental change in how they fought. Rather than advancing across open terrain, they now conducted a fighting withdrawal, using prepared positions and natural obstacles to slow the Soviet advance. The tactical emphasis shifted from maneuver to ambush, with German tanks concealing themselves along likely avenues of Soviet approach and engaging from maximum range. Oberleutnant Heinz Benza, a company commander in the 4th Panzer Division, explained this evolution. In 1941, we sought out the enemy. By late 1943, we let him come to us, choosing our ground carefully and engaging only when we held an advantage. Our survival depended on this discipline. This defensive approach played to the strengths of the upgraded Panzer IV. Its long-barreled gun could engage Soviet tanks at ranges where return fire was less effective, while careful positioning could compensate for its armor limitations. German crews also benefited from superior optics and fire control, allowing them to acquire targets and fire accurately more quickly than their Soviet counterparts. These advantages, combined with the increasing skill and experience of surviving tank crews, allowed the Panzer IV to maintain a favorable exchange ratio despite its technical inferiority to newer Soviet tanks. A study conducted by the German Army High Command in October 1943 found that Panzer IV units were destroying an average of 4.5 Soviet tanks for each loss suffered, a remarkable achievement given the circumstances. The tactical evolution of Panzer IV employment was accompanied by continuing technical modifications. Field workshops developed increasingly sophisticated armor upgrades, including additional plates welded to the glacis, front armor, and turret face. These modifications were often improvised based on available materials, resulting in distinctive variations that collectors and historians later termed field modifications. Some units applied concrete to their tanks as additional protection, while others attached spare track links to vulnerable areas. The effectiveness of these improvisations varied, but they represented the determination of German tank crews to maximize their chances of survival. More standardized was the addition of Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste coating, applied to German tanks from late 1943 to prevent Soviet infantry from attaching magnetic mines. This distinctive textured coating became a visual signature of late-war German armor, including the Panzer IV. The winter of 1943-44 brought further challenges for German armor on the Eastern Front. Fuel shortages, inadequate spare parts, and the harsh weather conditions reduced operational readiness rates across all Panzer units. For the Panzer IV, these logistical constraints were particularly acute. As newer tanks like the Panther and Tiger received priority for resources, Panzer IV units often had to improvise to keep their vehicles running. Crews scavenged parts from disabled tanks, modified components from civilian vehicles to fit military applications, and developed field expedients for common mechanical failures. One enterprising maintenance officer in the 12th Panzer Division created a manual of emergency repairs that circulated widely among Panzer units, providing instructions for bypassing damaged systems and keeping tanks operational with minimal resources. This adaptability reflected both German engineering ingenuity and the desperate circumstances in which these units now operated. Despite these efforts, the strategic situation continued to deteriorate. The Soviet winter offensive of 1943-44 pushed German forces out of Ukraine and back to the pre-war Polish border. As the Wehrmacht retreated, the remaining Panzer IVs fought a series of delaying actions, buying time for infantry units to withdraw to new defensive positions. The mobile nature of these operations placed enormous strain on both men and machines. Tank Commander Ernst Bachmann recalled, "We were constantly on the move, fighting by day and withdrawing by night. Mechanical breakdowns became as dangerous as enemy fire, as recovery vehicles were scarce, and being left behind meant certain capture." Yet even in these dire circumstances, the Panzer IV's fundamental soundness as a design allowed it to remain effective when properly supported. As the German retreat continued, an increasingly important factor in the effectiveness of Panzer IV units was crew experience. By early 1944, the Wehrmacht had lost many of its veteran tank crews, but those who survived had developed exceptional skills. Tank commanders like Johannes Bölter, Kurt Knispel, and Ernst Bachmann achieved remarkable success despite the technical limitations of their vehicles, demonstrating the crucial importance of human factors in armored warfare. These experienced crews developed an intuitive understanding of their tanks' capabilities and limitations, allowing them to engage Soviet armor under favorable conditions and withdraw when necessary. They also trained new crew members, passing on hard-won knowledge that official training programs could not provide. A captured German panzer officer told his Soviet interrogators, "A Panzer IV with a veteran crew is worth 3 with novices. The difference lies not in courage, but in the 1,000 small details of tank combat that can only be learned through experience." The summer of 1944 brought further challenges for the Wehrmacht with Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive that drove German forces back to the borders of East Prussia. The scale and speed of the Soviet advance overwhelmed German defensive efforts. Entire panzer divisions found themselves conducting a desperate retreat through territory ill-suited for armored operations. Dense forests, marshes, and destroyed bridges channeled retreating German columns into predictable routes, where Soviet aircraft and artillery took a heavy toll. For the remaining Panzer IVs, this phase of the war represented the ultimate test of their mobility and reliability. A report from the 5th Panzer Division in July 1944 highlighted the challenges. Our unit began the Soviet offensive with 79 operational Panzer IVs. After 2 weeks of continuous combat and retreat, we have 22 remaining. Of the losses, 31 were due to enemy action, while 26 were abandoned due to mechanical failure or fuel exhaustion when recovery was impossible. This account typified the experience of panzer units during this period. The Panzer IV, despite its proven reliability, could not overcome the strategic realities of Germany's collapsing position in the east. As German forces fell back into defensive positions along the Vistula River, the remaining tanks were increasingly employed as mobile strongpoints rather than exploitation forces. By late 1944, the production of Panzer IVs had been significantly affected by Allied bombing of German industry. The main production facilities at Krupp, Grusenwerk, and Womag suffered repeated attacks, reducing output and quality. To maintain production, factories introduced simplifications that reduced manufacturing time but sometimes compromised performance. The late production Panzer IV Josf J, for example, eliminated the power traverse system for the turret to save on electrical components, forcing crews to rotate the turret manually, a significant disadvantage in combat situations requiring rapid target acquisition. Other simplifications included reduced vision ports, simplified road wheels, and the elimination of non-essential equipment. These changes reflected the desperate circumstances of Germany's war economy, where the primary goal had shifted from producing optimal weapons to producing sufficient quantities to sustain the fighting. Despite these compromises, the Panzer IV remained the backbone of Germany's tank forces until the end of the war. Even as production of newer designs like the Panther and Jagdpanzer I4 increased, the Panzer IV's simpler manufacturing requirements and proven reliability ensured its continued production. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had extensive experience with the tank in both North Africa and Normandy, advocated for its continued manufacture, arguing that a proven weapon in sufficient numbers is preferable to superior designs that cannot reach the front in time. This pragmatic approach reflected the harsh realities of Germany's strategic position as the war entered its final phases. The final year of the war saw the Panzer IV fighting on German soil as Soviet forces pushed into East Prussia, Pomerania, and eventually Berlin itself. By this stage, the tank was outclassed by the latest Soviet designs. The T-34-85, with its powerful 85mm gun, could penetrate a Panzer IV's frontal armor at most combat ranges. The IS-2 heavy tank, mounting a massive 120mm gun, could disable a Panzer IV with a single hit at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. Soviet numerical superiority had also become overwhelming, with some sectors facing odds of 10-1 or greater. Fuel shortages often reduced mobility to the point where tanks operated as static defensive positions, moving only when absolutely necessary to conserve precious fuel. In these final battles, the crews of the remaining Panzer IVs fought with the knowledge that defeat was inevitable. Their efforts focused on delaying the Soviet advance long enough to allow civilians to escape westward. A gunner from the 4th Panzer Division described the grim calculus of these last engagements. Each tank we disabled meant a few more hours for the refugees behind us. That became our measure of success, not territory held or enemy formations destroyed, but time bought for our people to reach safety. This sentiment reflected the changing priorities of many German soldiers in the war's final months, as national survival gave way to more immediate human concerns. The human dimension of the Panzer IV story is perhaps best illustrated by the personal accounts of those who fought in these tanks during the war's final phases. Feldwebel Wilhelm Knauth, a Panzer IV commander in the 21st Panzer Division, kept a diary during the retreat from Poland in early 1945. His entries provide a vivid glimpse into the daily realities of tank warfare on the Eastern Front. January 17, 1945. Ammunition down to 15 rounds. Fuel sufficient for perhaps 20 kilometers. No contact with battalion headquarters since yesterday. We are operating on our own initiative now, engaging Soviet spearheads when we can and withdrawing when necessary. The civilian refugees on the roads make our movement difficult. We dare not push them aside with the tank, so our progress is slow. The faces of the old people and children haunt me at night. As Germany's military situation collapsed in April 1945, the few remaining operational Panzerdoffs shared the fate of the forces they had served. Some fought until the very end, eventually disabled by Soviet armor or anti-tank teams. Others were abandoned by their crews, who recognized the futility of further resistance and sought to surrender to Western forces rather than face Soviet captivity. A few escaped to Czechoslovakia, where they participated in the final actions against Soviet forces before Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945. With the war's end, the story of the Panzer IV in German service came to a close. Yet its legacy would continue in unexpected ways. In the aftermath of World War II, hundreds of surviving Panzer IVs were captured by the victorious Allies. While Western powers quickly scrapped most of these vehicles, the Soviet Union provided substantial numbers to its new satellite states in Eastern Europe. More significantly, dozens were transferred to Syria, where they would see combat again during the 1967 Six-Day War against Israel, a remarkable testament to the design's durability. Others found their way to Spain, where they remained in service into the 1960s. This post-war service life, unusual for a World War II-era tank, reflected the fundamental soundness of the Panzer IV's design and its adaptability to changing requirements. For military historians and strategists, the story of the Panzer IV's resurrection on the Eastern Front offers valuable lessons about the balance between technological sophistication and practical effectiveness. While newer German tanks like the Panther and Tiger were technically superior, their complexity made them difficult to produce in sufficient numbers and challenging to maintain in the field. The Panzer IV, with its simpler design and greater reliability, could be produced, repaired, and modified more easily, qualities that proved crucial as Germany's strategic position deteriorated. As German General Heinz Guderian noted in his post-war memoirs, "The perfect is the enemy of the good." While our engineers pursued technical perfection, our troops needed reliable tanks in sufficient numbers. The experience of upgrading and refitting the Panzer IV also influenced post-war tank development around the world. The concept of an adaptable, medium-weight main battle tank, capable of being upgraded throughout its service life, became a cornerstone of Cold War armored vehicle design philosophy. Modern tanks like the American M1 Abrams, German Leopard 2, and Russian T-90 all reflect this evolutionary approach, with successive upgrades allowing basic designs to remain competitive for decades. In this sense, the Panzer IV was ahead of its time, pioneering the concept of phased improvement that characterizes modern military procurement. The technical evolution of the Panzer IV throughout the war also demonstrates the critical importance of adaptability in weapons design. When first introduced in the late 1930s, the tank was conceived primarily as an infantry support vehicle, with its short-barreled 75-meter gun optimized for firing high-explosive shells against soft targets. By the war's end, it had evolved into a dedicated tank hunter with a high-velocity gun capable of defeating most Allied armor at combat ranges. This transformation required not only technical modifications, but conceptual flexibility, a willingness to reimagine the vehicle's role based on changing battlefield requirements. This lesson was not lost on post-war military planners, who increasingly emphasized adaptable designs capable of fulfilling multiple roles. Beyond its technical and tactical significance, the Panzer IV's story illuminates broader aspects of the Eastern Front experience. The desperate efforts to recover and refit damaged tanks reflect the growing resource constraints that hampered German operations as the war progressed. The improvised modifications developed by field workshops demonstrate how frontline necessity drove innovation outside official channels. The experiences of tank crews reveal the human dimension of mechanized warfare, the fear, camaraderie, pride, and resignation that characterized service in Germany's panzer forces during the war's final years. In this sense, the Panzer IV serves as a lens through which we can examine not just the evolution of armored warfare, but the overall German experience on the Eastern Front. For the men who fought in Panzer III's on the Eastern Front, the tank represented something more personal, a home, a weapon, and often their only protection against the harsh realities of war. Their experiences encompassed the full spectrum of human emotion: pride in their technical skills, camaraderie with fellow crew members, fear in the face of increasingly powerful enemy weapons, and ultimately the resignation of fighting a lost war. Karl Körner, a Panzer IV commander who survived the war, perhaps best summarized this perspective. We knew by 1944 that the war was lost, but we also knew that surrendering to the Soviets meant hardship or worse. So we fought on, not for political reasons, but for each other and to buy time for civilians to flee westward. Our old tanks, patched up and sent back to the front again and again, were like us, exhausted, but still fighting. The daily reality of Panzer IV crews on the Eastern Front was shaped by both external threats and the characteristics of the tank itself. The interior was cramped, with 5 men, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, sharing a space roughly the size of a modern bathroom. Summer temperatures inside could exceed 50 degrees Celsius, while in winter the metal surfaces became painfully cold to touch without gloves. The noise was deafening, with a 300-horsepower Maybach engine, squeaking tracks, and clanking suspension making normal conversation impossible. Communication relied on throat microphones and headsets connected to the tank's intercom system. In combat, the confined space became even more challenging, filled with the acrid smell of cordite from fired shells, the mechanical clatter of the breech opening and closing, and the tension of knowing that an enemy round could penetrate at any moment. Despite these hardships, many tank crews developed a powerful attachment to their vehicles. Tanks were often named and decorated with personal symbols or mascots. Regular maintenance became a ritual that bonded the crew, with each man taking responsibility for specific systems. Gunther Stiller, a Panzer IV driver in the 16th Panzer Division, wrote home, "Our tank is more than a machine to us. We have survived so much together that it feels almost alive, a 6th member of the crew. We know every sound it makes, every quirk of its behavior." When we lost our first Panzer IV in Ukraine, it felt like losing a comrade. This anthropomorphization of the tank reflects the intense psychological connection that developed between crews and their vehicles, a phenomenon observed across many armies and conflicts. The tactical employment of Panzer IVs evolved significantly as the war progressed, and German forces transitioned from offensive to defensive operations. By early 1944, German armored doctrine emphasized methodical, coordinated actions rather than the fluid, opportunistic maneuvers that had characterized the earlier mobile warfare period. Panzer IVs typically operated in platoons of 4 to 5 tanks, with each platoon assigned specific tactical tasks based on terrain and enemy dispositions. A typical defensive engagement might unfold as follows. Tanks would take up hull-down positions behind natural or prepared terrain features. concealed when possible by camouflage netting or natural vegetation. They would remain hidden until Soviet reconnaissance elements had passed, then engage the main force from the flank or rear. After firing a few rounds, they would immediately change position to avoid return fire and artillery strikes. This shoot-and-scoot tactic maximized the Panzer IV's strengths while minimizing its vulnerabilities. As Soviet numerical superiority increased, German tank commanders placed growing emphasis on coordination with other arms. Infantry equipped with anti-tank weapons provided close protection against Soviet tank hunter teams. Self-propelled anti-tank guns like the Marder and Jagdpanzer covered likely approach routes with their powerful long-range guns. Artillery observers traveled with tank units to call in fire missions against concentrations of Soviet armor. This combined arms approach reflected the recognition that tanks alone could not win battles against a numerically superior enemy with growing technical sophistication. Colonel Hans von Luck, who commanded a combined arms battle group in the final years of the war, observed, "The days when tanks alone could decide battles were over. Our survival depended on the seamless integration of all arms, each compensating for the other's weaknesses." The technical inferiority of the Panzer IV relative to late-war Soviet designs forced German commanders to emphasize qualitative advantages where they existed. Superior optics remained a significant German advantage throughout the war. The standard German Turmziel Fernrohr (TZF) gunner's sight provided better magnification and clarity than its Soviet counterparts, allowing more accurate fire at long ranges. German tanks also maintained an edge in radio equipment, with most Panzer RFs equipped with both short and long-range radios that permitted efficient tactical coordination. These advantages, combined with generally superior crew training, allowed German armored units to maintain combat effectiveness despite growing material disadvantages. Soviet General Pavel Rotmistrov, commander of the 5th Guards Tank Army, acknowledged this reality in a post-war interview. "The Germans fought with great skill until the end. Even when we had superior tanks in greater numbers, they remained dangerous opponents because of their tactical discipline and gunnery precision." The story of the Panzer IV is inseparable from the broader narrative of the Eastern Front, the largest and most brutal military campaign in history. Between 1941 and 1945, this theater claimed millions of lives on both sides. The campaign saw unprecedented hardship with extreme weather conditions, limited supplies, and the constant stress of combat taking a severe toll on the soldiers of both armies. For the tank crews of the Panzer IV, the experience was characterized by extreme hardship and a constant struggle for survival against increasingly unfavorable odds. By early 1945, as Soviet forces pushed into German territory, the remaining Panzer IV units faced the final act of their long struggle on the Eastern Front. The strategic situation was hopeless, with overwhelming Soviet numerical superiority, critical fuel shortages, and the collapse of organized logistics. Yet many units continued to fight with remarkable determination. The motivations varied: concern for civilian refugees, personal loyalty to comrades, or simply the momentum of years of warfare. Whatever their reasons, these final battles represented the culmination of the Panzer IV's long evolution from an offensive weapon of mobile warfare to a defensive bulwark in a lost war. A surviving action report from a Panzer IV company of the Brandenburg Division, dated April 16, 1945, provides a glimpse into these final engagements. Enemy attacked at dawn with approximately 60 tanks, primarily T-34-85s, supported by 2 regiments of infantry. Our 8 operational panzers engaged from prepared positions near Cottbus, disabled 11 enemy tanks before ammunition, exhausted, withdrew to secondary positions at 1400 hours. 3 of our tanks lost to mechanical breakdown during withdrawal, crews continuing on foot. Remaining 5 tanks now forming defensive line at Drebkow with local militia and youth anti-tank teams. Fuel sufficient for perhaps 1 more day of operations, awaiting orders. No further reports from this unit survive, suggesting they were overrun in the subsequent fighting. As Germany collapsed in late April and early May 1945, the few surviving Panzerers shared its fate. Some fought to the end in the rubble of Berlin, eventually destroyed by Soviet armor or anti-tank teams. Others were abandoned by their crews, who recognized the futility of further resistance and sought to surrender to Western forces. A few escaped to Czechoslovakia, where they participated in the final actions against Soviet forces before Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945. With the war's end, the story of the Panzer IV in German service came to a close. Yet its legacy would continue in unexpected ways. In the aftermath of World War II, hundreds of surviving Panzer IVs were captured by the victorious Allies. While Western powers quickly scrapped most of these vehicles, the Soviet Union provided substantial numbers to its new satellite states in Eastern Europe. More significantly, dozens were transferred to Syria, where they would see combat again during the 1967 Six-Day War against Israel, a remarkable testament to the design's durability. Others found their way to Spain, where they remained in service into the 1960s. This post-war service life, unusual for a World War II-era tank, reflected the fundamental soundness of the Panzer IV's design and its adaptability to changing requirements. For military historians and strategists, the story of the Panzer IV's resurrection on the Eastern Front offers valuable lessons about the balance between technological sophistication and practical effectiveness. While newer German tanks like the Panther and Tiger were technically superior, their complexity made them difficult to produce in sufficient numbers and challenging to maintain in the field. The Panzer IV, with its simpler design and greater reliability, could be produced, repaired, and modified more easily, qualities that proved crucial as Germany's strategic position deteriorated. As German General Heinz Guderian noted in his post-war memoirs, "The perfect is the enemy of the good." While our engineers pursued technical perfection, our troops needed reliable tanks in sufficient numbers. The experience of upgrading and refitting the Panzer IV also influenced post-war tank development around the world. The concept of an adaptable, medium-weight main battle tank, capable of being upgraded throughout its service life, became a cornerstone of Cold War armored vehicle design philosophy. Modern tanks like the American M1 Abrams, German Leopard 2, and Russian T-90 all reflect this evolutionary approach, with successive upgrades allowing basic designs to remain competitive for decades. In this sense, the Panzer IV was ahead of its time, pioneering the concept of phased improvement that characterizes modern military procurement. The technical evolution of the Panzer IV throughout the war also demonstrates the critical importance of adaptability in weapons design. When first introduced in the late 1930s, the tank was conceived primarily as an infantry support vehicle, with its short-barreled 75-meter gun optimized for firing high-explosive shells against soft targets. By the war's end, it had evolved into a dedicated tank hunter with a high-velocity gun capable of defeating most Allied armor at combat ranges. This transformation required not only technical modifications but conceptual flexibility, a willingness to reimagine the vehicle's role based on changing battlefield requirements. This lesson was not lost on post-war military planners who increasingly emphasized adaptable designs capable of fulfilling multiple roles. For the men who fought in these tanks, the Panzer IV represented both a weapon and a home, a steel shell that offered protection in an environment of unprecedented danger. Their experiences encompassed the full spectrum of human emotion, pride in their technical skills, camaraderie with fellow crew members, fear in the face of increasingly powerful enemy weapons, and ultimately the resignation of fighting a lost war. Hans Müller, one of the few Panzer IV commanders to survive from the beginning of Barbarossa to the war's end, perhaps best captured this complex reality in a post-war interview. "Our tanks were never the best, but they were good enough when handled correctly. We learned to make the most of what we had, to fight intelligently rather than recklessly. In the end, no tank, however powerful, could have changed the outcome. We were simply overwhelmed by the resources arrayed against us. But I remain proud of how we fought, with professionalism and determination, even in hopeless circumstances. The tale of the Panzer IV's return to the Eastern Front encapsulates both the ingenuity and the tragedy of Germany's war effort. From the workshops where damaged tanks were painstakingly rebuilt to the battlefields where their upgraded guns finally proved capable of defeating Soviet armor, the story embodies the determination and resourcefulness that characterized the Wehrmacht at its best. Yet it also reveals the fundamental strategic weaknesses that doomed Germany to defeat: the inability to match Soviet industrial production, the failure to develop standardized designs that could be manufactured efficiently, and the ultimately fatal decision to invade the Soviet Union in the first place. As the last operational Panzer IVs were finally destroyed or captured in May 1945, they left behind a complex legacy that continues to fascinate military historians and enthusiasts to this day. In museums and private collections around the world, surviving Panzer IVs stand as silent witnesses to this remarkable story. Their scarred armor, modified components, and field adaptations provide tangible evidence of the desperate struggle on the Eastern Front. Each tank bears the physical traces of its wartime service, the marks of battle damage, hasty repairs, and technical evolution under pressure. For visitors who encounter these machines today, they offer a visceral connection to the past, a reminder of both human ingenuity and the terrible cost of conflict. In their silent presence, we find echoes of the men who built them, fought in them, and often died in them, participants in one of history's greatest tragedies, now fading from living memory, but preserved in the artifacts they left behind. The story of the Panzer IV's resurrection and return to the Eastern Front thus stands as a testament to what human determination can achieve even in the most adverse circumstances. From obsolescence to renewed effectiveness and eventual defeat, these tanks and the men who crewed them faced the overwhelming material superiority of their adversaries with courage and resourcefulness. Their experience reminds us that behind the broad sweep of historical events and the cold calculations of strategy and tactics lie individual human stories of struggle, sacrifice, and survival. As we contemplate the rusting hulks of these once formidable machines, we are called to remember not only the engineering achievements they represent, but also the human cost of the conflict in which they participated, a legacy that continues to resonate in our world today.